better. There is a big echo. Yes, I heard that. I think now that should be a bit better, or at least I'm hopeful that it's a bit better at this point. So going through this a bit. So a brief. Okay, this sounds clear. Wonderful. I'm glad we're on board now. All right. So I do apologize for the technical difficulties. Wonderful. So a brief history at this point. So when we're talking about social emotional learning and we're talking about emotional intelligence here, intelligence was first defined as a stable construct that represented a person's intelligence and cognition. And so when we were talking about intelligence, we were primarily talking about an individual's IQ. And so at that point, historically, emotions were thought of as a hindrance to intelligence, something that stood in the way of an individual's ability to appropriately display or receive information. And so what's interesting is we know from our work on trauma that emotions do have a huge place in learning. And one of my favorite quotes is, we're not thinking creatures who feel, we're feeling creatures who think. So that emotions are primary to our ability to think and process information. And a lot of the work that we do is really, that brain I just showed you, the regulate, relate, reason. Well, our ability to reason, our ability to do things that require that intellect is really dependent on our ability to be regulated in the moment. It's really dependent on where our emotional state is. And so there were a few early researchers who started to think that emotion might be a necessary component of intelligence, but the two were still conceptualized pretty differently. If you're familiar with a lot of the research in education, Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is something that we think about a lot when we think about, an early pioneer and somebody who started to think of intelligence beyond just the scope of IQ, beyond what we are learning in terms of our ability to take in and reproduce information. So early models of emotional intelligence disagree a bit on whether emotional intelligence is a cognitive ability or if it's a personal trait. And so when we start to think through some of that, part of the thing is when we're teaching students and we're working with them, well, it really doesn't matter. What we know about emotional intelligence is that it can be built. And we know that those skills are skills that we can capitalize and grow within our students, within our children. And so, we'll let the researchers, the academics kind of focus on whether it's a cognitive ability or a personality trait. What we know is that we can develop it, and we can develop those skills of emotional intelligence in our students and in our children. So one of the foremost names in emotional intelligence work is Goleman, and so he has 5 elements of emotional intelligence. And when you do any research on emotional intelligence, you learn anything about EQ, you're going to hear about the work of Goleman. And so what he says is that there are 5 primary things that are in focus when we talk about emotional intelligence. There's social skills, so the ability to communicate with others, the ability to understand what others are communicating to us, the ability to read some of those nonverbal skills, the ability to empathize and take the perspective of another individual. So those are social skills. Self-regulation, so learning self-calming, techniques allowing emotions to pass through you. A lot of elements of mindfulness really fall into the self-regulatory or self-regulation competency. Self-awareness, so knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, knowing your moods and triggers, what upsets me, what about this situation could potentially be helpful to me, and knowing those things is a really important concept or a really important component of emotional intelligence. Then motivation. So when you're faced with a challenge, what do you do with that challenge? Are you able to take that challenge and be resilient in the face of the challenge and move forward? Are you self-motivated? Are you disciplined? Do you have a sense of responsibility about how to move forward? And then lastly, empathy, the ability to take the mood and viewpoint of another. The ability to kind of feel the emotional state of another person, whether or not they're communicating that directly to you. The ability to practice acts of kindness on purpose, to be intentional about being kind to other people. And so these 5 things, social skills, self-regulation, self-awareness, motivation, and empathy, are the 5 components of Goleman's 1995 emotional intelligence model. So why is emotional intelligence important? Why do we care about emotional intelligence? Beyond the fact that it feels nice to interact with somebody who has a high emotional intelligence, why is it beneficial for us? Why is it important? So there have been a lot of studies on emotional contents or emotional intelligence. most of them have been in the context of business. And most of them have been looking at, when we look at leadership professionals, when we look at people who are successful in leading others, people who are successful in communicating with others, what are the common traits that these people have? And one of the things that they found is that emotional intelligence comes up over and over and over again when we're looking at people who are successful leaders. And so some of the things that we've found from studies are that happiness and success, both in terms of your career and in terms of how you personally define your success, how you personally define your own happiness, is related to both emotional intelligence, which is sometimes called EQ or emotional quotient, and IQ, so your intelligence quotient. And that's something that would be assessed with like an IQ test. So both of these are related to your happiness and your success in life. Oftentimes we can really think of people who have had examples of either, or who have had one in the absence of another. So we can think of examples of people who have had, high emotional intelligence, but lower on the intelligence scale, or high emotional, or high intellect, but low on the emotional intelligence scale. And when we think of these people, we can often begin to see gaps in their leadership, their approaches to things. We can often see, we can probably think of students who fall into those categories. And the focus starts to be, how can we develop those students? How can we further encourage those skills in students that they're lacking, those gaps there? This has also been related to success in medical school. So we think of medical school as something that is really, really necessary to have a high IQ. But students who have a higher EQ are actually more successful in medical school. And you can all probably think of examples of doctors or medical professionals that you've met who have had what we call bedside manner, is really a word that we apply to the medical, or a phrase that we apply to the medical profession. That really just means emotional intelligence. And so when you say that a doctor has good bedside manner, what you really mean is that doctor is kind in their speech to you. That doctor is, knows how to feel your emotion, is sensitive to the emotion that you feel as the patient, is able to communicate with you beyond just the basics, but is able to meet you where you are and meet your emotional needs as the patient. And so all of those things are really components of emotional intelligence that we look for in medical professionals. Emotional intelligence is related to a higher salary. It's related to better teamwork. And so on teams where people do have higher emotional intelligence, everybody says, these people are better at working with others. They're better at being collaborators. They're better at communicating in groups. Performance in terms of just pure performance tasks. Again, this has mostly been studied in business context. So the ability to communicate with clients, the ability to to sell if the person is a salesman. All of these things are related to their ability to have high emotional intelligence. In schools, though, when we talk about emotional intelligence, what we really call it is social emotional learning. And it's interesting that in different contexts, these are called different things. But I'll show a diagram on the next slide that shows just how similar our current model of emotional intelligence is to the original Goleman model our current model of SEL, social emotional learning, one of the primary frameworks used across the country, how closely related that is to the original 1995 Goleman emotional intelligence model. So when we talk about SEL, social emotional learning, sometimes that's called prosocial behavior, but again, it's referring to the same thing. And when social emotional learning is encouraged within school systems, it's related to decreased conduct referrals. It's related to decreased internalizing behaviors in students. And so internalizing behaviors for students are things that are going to be, sometimes they're related to anxious behavior, but they're behaviors where a student might be ruminating in their head, might be thinking about something that's going on in their lives, and that's pulling them away from really attending to the things that are outside of them. And so when we have a student who internalizes, oftentimes they just don't have the ability or feel like they have the ability to communicate what they're feeling in the moment. And so when we're thinking through why do we care about emotional intelligence for our students, for our children, it's because of all these outcomes. And we talk a lot in neurologic about neuroplasticity, about the brain's ability to change and the brain's ability to adapt. And this is really, really important here because social emotional skills and emotional intelligence can be learned. They can be developed. And so your emotional intelligence is not static over the course of your life. Many studies of IQ say that a lot of IQ is genetic, and a lot of IQ is based on what you were born with. But emotional intelligence is something you can cultivate and develop not only in yourself, but it's something you can cultivate and develop in the children and students that you work with as well. And so if anything, that should give us a lot of hope, because all of the things that we want students to be able to do, we want them to be able to have fulfilling, successful lives. We want them to be able to complete work. We want them to be able to find joy, to reach their passions. We want them to be able to communicate with others, to have positive, healthy relationships. All of these things that we want for our students, that we want for our children, really that we want for most people that are in our lives, if not all people that are in our lives, are things that can really be developed. And a lot of components of that are really based in emotional intelligence. And so as I mentioned before, when we talk about EQ or emotional quotient, what we're really talking about in the context of education is SEL. It's social emotional learning. So while the terms EI and EQ are still utilized, and oftentimes they're utilized in different contexts, a lot of the EQ skills identified even in the earliest conceptualizations have become the basis, have really become the foundation of what we're talking about when we're talking about SEL, when we're talking about social emotional learning, which is something that we talk about in early childhood education, elementary, middle, secondary, post-secondary even. And we're talking about how to cultivate it in employees too. And so it's something really from birth until, ultimately through death, that we want to talk about how do we get better at these skills? How do we further develop them? And it's just that in schools, we happen to use this model. So the image that we have here to the right is from CASEL. So CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And they produce one of the primary frameworks for social emotional learning that's used nationally. So about, I believe now the number is, there are 22 states, and I could be off by a state or two, but I think it's about 22 states have adopted social emotional learning standards within their state curriculum. So they're saying social emotional learning is so important that we want every student K to 12 to really be learning these skills. And a lot of times they develop entire curriculums or curricula based on this framework. And what's interesting here is if you look at the competencies here, self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness, they're very, very, very similar to Goleman's emotional intelligence model. And that's by design, because what social emotional learning is it's saying we want students to have the skills that they need to be successful. And we want them to be emotionally intelligent because we think it's related to their ability not only to thrive in this academic environment, but also to thrive in their lives. And so what is the relationship between a lot of the work that we do around supporting students who have experienced trauma, around supporting students who are very, very highly stressed? Social emotional learning is like the other side of the coin from trauma. So when an individual has experienced trauma and something triggers them, oftentimes they'll go to the lower parts of the brain. They'll go to the midbrain, they'll go to the brainstem, and they'll function primarily from those parts of the brain. And when we think of what we're doing when we're teaching students social emotional skills, a lot of that is focused in that limbic area. A lot of that is focused on those relational skills. And if an individual has spent a lot of time focusing on survival, a lot of time focusing on protecting themselves, a lot of time focusing on coping mechanisms, what they've done is they've really spent a lot of time in the lower part of their brain. And so what we want to do is we want to teach them the skills to be able to calm themselves, teach them the skills to soothe the midbrain and the brainstem, teach them the skills so that they're able to fully access the full capacity of their brains. And that is one of the best ways, that's one of the best tools that we have to actually harness neuroplasticity and be able to have students actually be able to attend to the academics that we want them to attend to in school systems. We want to do that soothing. And so how do we do that soothing? Well, we teach them how to self-soothe. We teach them how to regulate. And what that's doing is that's teaching them the functional basis of social emotional learning. That's teaching them how to have that emotional intelligence. And it starts at that bottom there. It starts with how do we do that bottom-up regulation that I talked about in the beginning? How do I soothe my somatosensory systems? How do I calm myself in the moment so that I'm able to relate to those around me? Because if I'm not calm, if I'm not regulated, for a variety of reasons. Either I've never had social emotional learning skills modeled for me, or I've experienced too much trauma and I've been focused for the majority of my life on survival, or I have an abundance of triggers and not an abundance of support, whatever it might be. But if I'm in that bottom part of my brain and I'm feeling dysregulated, and I don't have those social emotional learning skills, I don't have the emotional intelligence to calm and regulate myself, well, then that's really the focus of what we need to do. We really need to focus on giving that kid, that student, that child, a bigger toolkit to support their own social emotional learning, to support their own emotional intelligence at that time. So how do we develop emotional intelligence, or how do we develop social emotional learning skills in students? First, increase your awareness of age-appropriate social and emotional skills. This is something that I personally talk with teachers a lot about, and I talk with parents a lot about this too. We have oftentimes in schools, and I have 3 young children of my own, and I've been guilty of this at times too, we have unrealistic expectations of what our kids' social and emotional skills should be at certain ages. I've been in elementary classrooms where teachers have been like, I really just need you to pay attention to what I'm saying for, 30 to 45 minutes. And that's not developmentally matched to where that kid is in the moment. And so we really want to say, well, what is an age-appropriate social and emotional skill that I should work on with this kid? And what's interesting is that everybody developmentally, even at the same age, isn't in the same place. And so if I have a kid that I'm working with who has had a substantial amount of trauma and may have developed a bit differently because of that trauma, well, they might not be at the level where their chronological age is. Developmentally, in terms of their social emotional learning, they might be down at a younger age. And you'll see that when they start to get dysregulated. I've had high schoolers who have gotten so mad that they've thrown what very much looks like an adult almost throwing a tantrum. And what that is showing me is that, well, they've never developed beyond those social emotional skills. So I'm going to meet them where they are in the moment. I'm going to meet them where they are and respond to that, not in a demeaning or belittling way, but I'm going to respond to that. And I'm going to try to teach them those skills that they don't have, to name how they're feeling in the moment, to talk about that emotional self-awareness, to be able to say, well, where are they in the moment, and how can I meet them there? If you are a teacher and you're in an academic setting, even if you're a parent, using texts and characters where possible can be really helpful. What that does for people is it takes away the personalization. It takes away that need to be, for that student and that child to be vulnerable in that moment. And so, I've done this with my own son, and in reading a book, how is that character feeling about their situation in the moment? What are they doing with the feelings that they have? What would you do if you were in that situation? But really talking about it as if it's a neutral third party. So it doesn't feel personal between you as the adult and whatever child you're talking to in that moment. So using characters can be really helpful. For students that are even younger and aren't really reading books at the moment, or don't really have the ability to kind of comprehend a larger plot, you can use puppets. Puppets can be really helpful in helping students to begin to think of, how could I explain how this thing is feeling in this scenario that I'm given, but it doesn't feel like I'm talking about myself, but I'm still learning that ability to develop that emotional vocabulary. I'm still learning that ability to communicate about feelings, to feel open and vulnerable. And I may not be talking about myself in that moment, but I'm developing that capacity. Along that line, play-based activities are really good. And I know we tend to think of that as appropriate for like early childhood education or even for elementary education. But play-based activities can be really good for many students. And what's interesting is that I've often said that Simon Says is a really good game to teach students self-regulation. And so as you get to middle school, Simon Says is still, a really interesting and fun game for students to play. And the reason is because you have to pause in that moment to think of, did he or she say Simon Says, and then what do I need to do? So you're not responding based on your immediate gut impulse, but you're responding in that moment based after a pause. And taking that pause develops the capacity to do that, to pause, to think, and then to respond. And that's a huge piece of just emotional intelligence, a huge piece of self-regulation, is that ability to take that pause. So using play-based activities with kids, again, takes away from that personalization. It takes away from, oh, this is just another thing that I have to learn or another thing that I have to do. And it really puts children in the position to say, well, how can I do this and have fun, but also learn these skills that are helpful to develop my capacity. Daniel Siegel, who wrote the book No Drama Discipline, and about 10 other books, if I remember correctly, really, really amazing psychologist. He talks about name it to tame it. So having students primarily start with naming emotions. I feel, and then what can I do to address that feeling? I feel happy. This is what I can do to address that feeling. I feel sad. This is what I can do to address that feeling. And providing a lot of opportunities within that environment to really regulate and to really say, well, what in this physical environment have I provided the student or have I provided the child that would give them the opportunity to regulate and to calm down and to use those social emotional skills. Group activities, teamwork, really the how of doing things. And so, I've often heard people say when I talk about social emotional learning, well, what about math teachers? What do math teachers do when it comes time for social emotional learning? Well, math teachers can address social emotional competencies by how they're asking students to learn, by what they're asking students to do and communicating with each other. And that can be done in any classroom, regardless of the content that they're teaching. Because when we're teaching students how to do things, we're really teaching them, how to utilize those skills. Also, we're teaching them content at the same time. So those don't have to be separate from each other. Positive relationships. Students learn a lot from our ability to relate to them. They learn what an adult-child relationship or adult-student relationship should look like. And so when we're engaging in those positive relationships, we are really teaching students social emotional skills. And what's fascinating is that people pick up a lot from those relationships. People pick up what you're modeling. People pick up how you're speaking to them, how you're communicating with others around you. And the more they develop a positive relationship with a person who displays high emotional intelligence, the more they'll begin to pick up on those traits that you are displaying and modeling. And so modeling is probably one of the best ways that we can actually show emotional intelligence. I've talked to students will, very easily sense things that are happening within a school building. And so if they've just heard a social emotional learning lesson from a teacher, and then they've seen that same teacher have a negative interaction with, another adult in the building, that lesson was just completely washed away because what they've picked up was the modeling more than what the lesson was supposed to be. And while I'm a huge proponent of social emotional learning lessons, I'm also a proponent of keeping yourself in check and making sure that you're modeling what exactly it is that you want students to be doing. So co-regulating with your student, making sure that you yourself are regulated, that you're aware of the areas of your own emotional intelligence where you need to grow and develop and work on, and also areas of your own emotional intelligence where you're strong and you want to model and you want to show examples of how to help students get there. And two other things, increasing frustration tolerance or comfort with failure. We want students to be able to, get rid of that perfectionist tendency of I have to be perfect at everything at all times, because that's just not realistic. That's just not how life works. And it's unfortunate. It would be a lot easier if we could all just be perfect at everything. But we want to make sure that we're giving students opportunities to feel frustrated and then manage that frustration. I can honestly say as a parent, I have the desire to take away all frustrations from my children. I think that's natural. That was natural for me as a teacher to feel that way for my students as well. But what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we give them those moments of manageable frustration so that they develop the capacity to feel that frustration and know what to do with it. And so if you see a student getting frustrated, don't automatically pull them away from that activity. If they're at a point where they're not dysregulated, work them through that activity. Allow them to feel and own that frustration and also to move past it. And then lastly, if you can incorporate social emotional learning into all curriculum, and that's if you're in a school building, if you're working with students day in and day out, or you're in some other setting where you're working with students, but also if you're working with children, if you're working with children in a home environment, if you are a parent. I know we don't have curriculum for parents, that doesn't exist, but think about how am I going to actually talk to my kids about social emotional learning? How am I actually going to talk to them about some of these components of emotional intelligence that I do want to cultivate? So 3 important notes, and I know we're coming right up against time here, but I will just finish these 3 and then I'll open it up for some additional questions. First, social emotional skills are culturally bound, and so we want to make sure that we are not using our own framework of what it means to be respectful or what it means to communicate appropriately, and assuming that in every culture that's identical across all students and all cultures, because it's not. And a lot of people, people mostly primarily learn their social emotional skills from their community and their environment. And we want to make sure that we're not penalizing students for things that are just culturally bound, that aren't a match to ours. And so learning the skill of like intercultural communication is as important for our students as it is for us. And so when we're communicating with somebody who does have a different background and does have a different culture, that we're really thinking through, well, what does it mean in that culture to communicate appropriately? Or what does it mean in that culture to show respect or to name an emotion? And that we're responding to those appropriately given the student's culture. Neurodiverse children may struggle with social emotional skills, be open to different expressions from neurodiverse individuals. And so if you have a student in your classroom, and you probably have several students in your classroom or students that you work with, or maybe your own children that are neurodiverse, a lot of them struggle with social emotional skills. And we want to make sure that we're not, that we're open to different expressions of emotion, and that we are, while we are teaching students how to communicate social emotional skills appropriately, that we're also leaving space for the diversity that we have in students' brains. And then lastly, what you do will be far more important than what you say. I heard a quote many years ago that just stuck with me, which is that children don't often do what you say, but they almost always do what you do. And so what you're modeling, what you're showing, is a really, really important metric for how students will begin to measure themselves. And lastly, I know I just said lastly before, but this really is the last one because I want to get to the question that's posed. Practice makes progress. And so I don't say practice makes perfect, because perfect isn't the goal, progress is the goal, but practice makes progress. And like any other skill, it needs to be developed over time. And when we talk about the neurobiology of learning, a lot of times we talk about, well, how do we learn things? We learn things, we create new connections in our brain by doing things over and over and over. And so if you want a student to have the ability to communicate, well, they need to practice that positive communication over and over and over. If we want students to be self-aware, well, they have to practice opportunities to self-reflect and to look at themselves honestly in a safe environment over and over and over. And so the more opportunities that we provide for students to practice these skills, the more likely it is that students will continue to grow and develop. So the question that we have here that I'm going to highlight or try to highlight, hopefully you can see it. Maybe you can't see it. I can't see it anymore. All right. So can you talk more about how it can be improved and developed? Yeah, I mean, that's really what we were just talking about. So emotional intelligence can be developed by opportunities to practice discrete social emotional skills. And so one of those social emotional skills that we are talking about here, if we just isolate one, so intercultural communication or communicating with others. So if you want to further improve that skill and develop it, well, you need to set clear guidelines. So what does appropriate communication look like? You need to provide opportunities for practice. So here's something I want you to communicate on. Here's an opportunity to practice that. So anything that we want to improve and anything that we want to develop needs clear instruction and clear opportunities in a safe environment to practice. And honestly, I think that's one of the most challenging things when we really talk about social emotional learning and we talk about emotional intelligence, is that oftentimes we don't give students the time that they really need to practice these. And so we don't create we work to create safe environments where students can practice these things and make mistakes, and it's okay, and move forward. And so not to be redundant, but really at this point, it's about having the opportunity to practice those skills in an environment that is safe for them, physically and psychologically and emotionally. All right, so I am not seeing any other questions here right now. Thank you so much for joining us here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. at the any of our social media accounts or the email address listed above. I hope that you'll join us on August 25th for our next session. We talked a little bit today about how to create that environment that does feel safe. Josh will lead us next time talking about how to create that physical environment that feels safe for students. Thanks for joining us.